My friends, we gather here not to discuss the petty squabbles of the day, but to plumb the depths of a great human suffering, the compulsion to argue, to conquer, to be right in the eyes of another. You come to me feeling weary, your soul parched from pouring its waters onto the barren soil of another's rigid convictions. You believe you are fighting them. But I tell you, the most profound battle is not with the other, it is with the other within. When you argue with the fanatic, the narcissist, the unyielding critic, you are not engaging a whole person. You are engaging a fragment, a psychic entity that has swollen in power and declared itself the whole. You are, in essence, arguing with an autonomous complex, a splintered piece of the psyche that operates with a mind of its own, a ghost in the machine of their personality. To believe you can reason with a ghost is the height of folly. You throw your logic, your facts, your heartfelt pleas into the abyss of their unconsciousness, and they are swallowed whole, leaving no trace. Why? Because you are speaking the language of the ego to a shadow that does not listen. The desire to win an argument is often the desire to have one's own shadow recognized and approved by the other. It is the child in us, crying, "See me, validate me." But you cannot ask a blind man to describe your face. You cannot ask a person who has not confronted their own darkness to acknowledge the light you carry. So, I say to you, stop arguing with them. This is not surrender. This is the beginning of the most courageous act of psychological warfare you can wage. The war for your own soul. It is the first step on the path of individuation, the process of becoming who you truly are, separate from the enmeshed battles that define you in opposition to another. Seize the external quarrel, and you will hear the internal one begin. The voice of your opponent will grow faint, and in its place, you will hear the voice of your own shadow, the very qualities you so despise in them. You hate their rigidity. Look for your own. You despise their arrogance. Find its whisper within. For what irritates us in others can lead us to ourselves, if we have the courage to follow. When you stop feeding the external conflict, you withdraw a tremendous amount of libido, psychic energy, back into your own being. This energy, once wasted on a fruitless siege, can now be directed inward to build the fortress of yourself. You begin to integrate the warring parts of your own psyche. You no longer need to fight the tyrant outside, because you are learning to depose the tyrant within. You see, the human psyche is not a monolithic kingdom ruled by a single, rational king. It is more akin to a vast, ancient city, built over millennia, with bustling districts, quiet alleys, and, crucially, forgotten underground chambers. Within these subterranean spaces, certain psychological structures have taken up residence. We call these structures autonomous complexes. They are splinter psyches, psychic entities that have coalesced around a core of intense emotion, be it trauma, desire, or a forgotten wound. Like a submarine with a captured crew, they operate independently, following their own primitive logic and agenda. When you engage in a heated, repetitive, and fruitless argument, you are very rarely speaking to the conscious, reasonable ego of the other person. You are attempting to hold a parliamentary debate with one of these captured submarines. It does not hear you in the language of logic or empathy. It operates on a frequency of raw affect and deeply ingrained, often archaic, defense mechanisms. This complex has a life of its own. It is autonomous. It can seize control of the individual's speech, their thoughts, and their emotional responses, creating a kind of temporary possession. The person before you is there in body, but the voice that speaks is the voice of the complex. Ghost in the machine, reciting a script written in the crypt of their personal history. This is why your well-reasoned points are met not with consideration, but with distortion, deflection, or raw unmediated emotion. You are presenting legal documents to a hurricane. The complex cannot process your facts because its very existence is predicated on a reality that supersedes fact. It is a self-contained system, a closed loop of psychic energy designed for one purpose: its own survival. To argue with it is to enter its territory, to play by its rules on its battlefield, and in doing so you inevitably lose, for the complex does not seek truth, it seeks to perpetuate itself. Your engagement is the very food it consumes. Your frustration is its validation. Your raised voice is a symphony confirming its central, powerful role in the psychic ecology of the other. Understanding this is the first and most crucial step toward liberation. It is the moment you realize you are not in a duel with a fellow knight, but are rather swinging your sword at a mirage, while the true source of your struggle remains hidden, deep within the labyrinth of another's unseen world. To understand this process, we must first accept a fundamental, yet difficult, principle of psychology that which we cannot bear in ourselves, we do not simply ignore. We actively expel from our conscious awareness, and then, as if by a kind of psychic magnetism, we perceive it living in the outer world, in others. This is the act of projection. It is an unconscious, automatic process by which we disown the uncomfortable, shameful, or underdeveloped aspects of our own personality, what we call the shadow, and experience them instead as attributes of other people. When you are locked in a bitter argument, the intense emotional charge, the sheer fury or frustration, is very often a signal that you are not merely disagreeing with the other person, but are confronting a disowned part of yourself that you have projected onto them. The other person becomes a hook, a screen, upon which you have hung the coat of your own unresolved inner conflict. You see in them a rigidity, a foolishness, an arrogance, a cowardice that you refuse to acknowledge within your own soul. The energy you pour into the argument, then, is a perverse form of self-confrontation, a battle against your own reflection in the watery depths of another's psyche. You are shouting at a mirror, demanding that the image change, all the while refusing to turn and look upon the original face that casts the reflection. This is why these arguments feel so primal, so existential. You are not fighting for a point of logic, you are fighting for the integrity of your own self-concept. To admit they might be right, on even a small point, feels like a catastrophic tear in the fabric of your identity, because it threatens to expose the very quality you have exiled. The other person, often themselves possessed by a complex, is merely playing a role in your own internal drama. They are the actor who has unwittingly taken on the part of your shadow. When you withdraw the projection, you are not conceding the argument. You are performing a sacred act of psychic reclamation. You are saying, "This fury I feel, this judgment I wield, this quality I despise. I will take it back, I will own it, I will investigate its origins within me." This is not an act of self-blame, but of immense power. For what you have projected, you have made your master. What you reclaim, you can begin to integrate. The person across from you shrinks back to their natural size, no longer a monstrous carrier of your darkness, but merely another flawed human being. The energy that was bound up in hating them, in fighting them, is suddenly liberated and available to you. It becomes the fuel for introspection, for the true work of individuation. You cease trying to correct the world, and begin the more courageous task of correcting your own inner vision. The conflict does not vanish, but it is transformed. It moves from a battlefield between two egos to a dialogue within your own soul, a dialogue between who you believe yourself to be and who you truly, wholly are. The term libido in the deeper sense must not be understood merely as sexual drive, but as the very life force of the psyche itself. It is the quanta of psychic energy that animates our thoughts, our passions, our attentions, and our will. It is the capital of the soul, a finite and precious resource that can be invested, squandered, or hoarded. Every engagement with the outer world requires an expenditure of this energy. Now, consider the act of arguing, particularly with one who is possessed by an autonomous complex. This is not a simple exchange of ideas, a gentle tennis match of the intellect. It is a savage, draining war of attrition fought in a swamp. Your libido is poured out in a torrent to formulate your rebuttals, to steel yourself against their attacks, to manage your own rising affect, to wrestle with the cognitive dissonance of their unreason. This is a massive and continuous expenditure. You are, in effect, trying to fill a bottomless vessel. The complex of the other person, being a psychic entity that feeds on such engagement, draws your libido out of you, leaving you feeling hollowed, exhausted, and psychically impoverished. You have, quite literally, given your life force away to a phantom. The act of stopping the argument, therefore, is an act of severe and necessary conservation. It is the moment you recognize the bankruptcy of the endeavor and you cease the outflow. You turn off the tap. The energy that was flowing outward in a frantic, futile torrent is suddenly retained. This retained libido does not simply vanish, it pools within you. It accumulates, and this accumulated energy becomes the raw material for all true inner work. It is the fuel required for the difficult task of holding the tension of opposites within yourself. It is the power that allows you to observe your own shadow without flinching, to sit with your own anxiety, to engage in active imagination, and to build a conscious relationship with the contents of your own unconscious. When you are libidinally depleted by external conflict, you have no strength for this inner journey. You are a bankrupt king unable to rule his own domain. But when you conserve this energy, you become rich in potential. This stored power is what the alchemists sought in their vessels. It is the prima materia for the transformation of the personality. The same fiery energy that was being wasted in anger and frustration toward the outer world is now available to heat the inner crucible, where the lead of the shadow is transformed into the gold of the self. To conserve your libido is to choose inner transformation over outer confrontation. It is to understand that the most powerful battles are not won by exhausting your resources on an external foe, but by gathering your strength to integrate the enemy within your own gates. To strive for individuation is to answer a call from the very center of your being, the self, which seeks its own unique and complete expression in the world. This is not a path of adding more knowledge or more social victories to the ego. It is a path of subtraction, of peeling away the false personas and collective expectations that have encrusted your essential nature. It is a descent into the depths, a deliberate turning away from the noise of the marketplace to listen to the whispers from the underworld of your own soul. Now consider the act of arguing. It is, by its very nature, an intensely externalizing activity. It forces your consciousness outward, projecting it onto the other, locking you in a dance of reaction and defense. Your entire psychic attention is captivated by the form of your opponent, the structure of their claims, the need to reboot and to conquer. In this state, you are entirely identified with the ego and its position. You are a soldier on a battlefield, and there is no room for introspection, for doubt, for the receptive listening that the inner world demands. The process of individuation, however, requires precisely the opposite movement. It demands a disciplined and courageous inward focus. It asks that you turn the spotlight of your consciousness away from the other and onto the parts of yourself that are being activated by the conflict. Why does this person's rigidity trigger such fury in you? What forgotten, rigid part of yourself are you being forced to confront? The argument becomes a mere symptom, a signpost pointing toward a neglected battlefield within your own psyche. When you stop arguing, you are not retreating, you are changing fronts. You are withdrawing your consciousness from the fruitless external skirmish so that it may be deployed for the true war of integration. This inner focus is the alchemical vessel where transformation occurs. Here, in the quiet space you have created by ceasing the external dialogue, the internal dialogue can begin. Here the ego can finally listen to the shadow, the persona can converse with the Anima or Animus, and the conscious mind can begin to form a living relationship with the vast, unexplored territory of the unconscious. This is not a passive or peaceful process, it is often a turbulent and painful one, for you are now facing the very conflicts you once projected onto others. But this is the only work that matters. The energy you once spent trying to correct the outer world is now used to reconcile the inner world. You begin to assemble the scattered fragments of your being into a new whole, where the once repulsed shadow is acknowledged and the inflated persona is deflated to its proper size. The individual who emerges from this labor is no longer a brittle, defensive ego, but a more fluid and resilient self, capable of engaging with the world not from a place of reactive conflict, but from a grounded center of wholeness. The outer argument becomes irrelevant not because the issue is resolved, but because you have resolved the deeper, personal conflict that gave the argument its destructive power. You have answered the call to become who you are, and in doing so, you have no need to win a debate to prove your existence. The ego, that conscious part of us which navigates the day-to-day world, is perpetually seeking validation from external sources. It looks to others for approval, to institutions for authority, and to victories in debate for confirmation of its own rightness. This is the root of our compulsion to argue, the ego's desperate attempt to have its reality confirmed by the outer world. It is a beggar at the banquet of life, always holding out its cup, hoping to be filled by the acknowledgement of others. But this is a futile endeavor, for the approval of the external world is fickle, fleeting, and often based on its own unconscious projections and complexes. To rely on it is to build your house upon the sands of another's psyche. The self, however, is of an entirely different nature. It is not the narrow, anxious ire of the ego, but the central archetypal nucleus of the entire personality, the image of God within us. It is the source of our deepest intuition, our sense of meaning, and our inherent, unshakable wholeness. The self does not need to be validated by the outside, for it contains its own validation within it. It is the sun at the center of our psychic solar system, around which the ego and all other complexes orbit. When you are locked in a bitter argument, your ego has been lured away from this central sun, and is lost in the darkness, flailing at phantoms. It has forgotten its true center. To stop arguing, then, is not an act of defeat, it is an act of reorientation. It is the conscious decision to turn away from the chaotic outer courtroom, and to seek the silent, inner chamber where the self resides as the true arbiter. This inner judge does not rule with the gavel of absolute, rigid right and wrong as the ego desires. Its judgment is more profound. It is a sense of inner consistency, of authenticity, of alignment with one's own deepest nature. The self asks not, did I win? But, did I act in accordance with my own truth? Did I remain whole? When you bring the conflict before this inner tribunal, the entire dynamic shifts. The frantic need to convince the other person evaporates, because you are no longer seeking their verdict. You are seeking your own. The opinions and projections of others, which once felt like existential threats, are reduced to mere data points. You can consider them, but they do not have the power to define you. From this centered place, your engagement with the world transforms. You may still state your views, you may even disagree passionately, but you do so from a foundation of inner authority, not from a place of desperate need. The energy is no longer one of conflict, but of expression. You speak your truth, not because you need the other to hear it, but because it is your truth to speak. This is the peace that passeth all understanding, which the ego seeks in victory, but can only find in surrender to the self. The argument was merely the ego's misguided attempt to find its center in the wrong universe. The true arbiter was waiting within all along, in the profound and silent depths of your own being. This principle strikes at the very heart of the heroic ego's fantasy. The belief that with enough logic, enough eloquence, or enough passionate force, we can storm the citadel of another's unconsciousness and plant the flag of our own truth upon its walls. This is a fundamental and tragic misunderstanding of the nature of the psyche. Consciousness is not a commodity to be handed from one person to another like a book. It is not a set of facts to be memorized. It is a hard-won achievement, an inner awakening that must be cultivated from within, born from the slow, often painful process of confronting one's own shadow and integrating the contents of the personal and collective unconscious. To be unconscious, in the Jungian sense, is not merely to be ignorant of a fact, it is to be possessed by an autonomous complex, to be identified with a persona, or to be governed by archetypal forces of which one has no awareness. It is to live in a state of psychic sleepwalking. You cannot shake a sleepwalker awake by shouting reasoned arguments from across the street. Your shouts merely become incorporated into their dream, distorted into a monster chasing them or a siren luring them. This is precisely what happens when you argue with an unconscious position. Your facts, your beautifully constructed logic, your appeals to empathy, all are sucked into the vortex of their complex and twisted to serve its narrative. The complex, in its defensive rigidity, uses your energy to fortify its own walls. Your attempt to enlighten becomes, paradoxically, the very thing that deepens the darkness, as it provides more material for the complex to rationalize its existence. The unconscious does not yield to the light of another's consciousness, it only yields to the light of its own. The spark must be struck from within. The individual must themselves experience the tension of the opposites, the discomfort of their own contradictions, and feel the nascent yearning for something more whole. Your role, therefore, cannot be that of the sun, trying to illuminate a cave from the outside. It can only be, at best, that of a mirror, reflecting back their own statements so that they might, perhaps, catch a glimpse of their own contradiction. Or it can be the role of a silent witness, whose very refusal to engage in the chaotic dance creates a space where the other might, for a fleeting moment, hear the silence and sense the void where their own consciousness should be. To accept that you cannot enlighten the unconscious is to surrender a crushing burden. It is to recognize the sacred boundary of the individual soul. It liberates you from the messianic task of saving others from themselves and returns you to the only work that has any true efficacy, the tending of your own inner light. By focusing on your own enlightenment, on your own process of individuation, you become a living demonstration of what consciousness can be. You become a lighthouse, not a bulldozer. You offer a beacon for those who are already straining to see through their own fog. But you cease the futile and arrogant endeavor of trying to disperse the fog for them. The transformation must be an inner alchemy, and no alchemist can perform the great work in another's vessel. When you find yourself locked in a bitter, repetitive argument, be it with a colleague, a family member, or a voice in the political sphere, you are almost certainly not fighting about the surface-level topic. The content, the budget, the household chore, the political policy, is but the visible tip of a vast, submerged iceberg of psychic material. It is the symbol, the modern-day myth, through which a much older and more profound archetypal drama is being played out. The ego, in its literal mindedness, gets caught in the details of the set, arguing over the color of the curtain or the placement of a prop, while entirely missing the archetypal play unfolding on the stage. The conflict is seldom about what it appears to be. It is a symbolic enactment of a tension within your own psyche, projected outward for you to witness, if you have the eyes to see. That person who embodies rigid, unbending tradition is not merely a conservative, they are the symbolic representation of the Senex archetype, the old king who represents order, structure, and the law, a force that may be stifling your own inner poor, the eternal youth who seeks freedom, possibility, and revolution. Conversely, the chaotic and rebellious figure is not merely an anarchist. They are the embodiment of the trickster or the shadow of your own repressed desire for liberation, challenging the tyrannical inner critic that rules your inner world. The argument is an externalized ritual of an internal war between these powerful, impersonal forces. You are not arguing with your father about a career choice. You are arguing with the archetype of authority. You are not bickering with your partner about money. You are acting out a drama of security versus freedom, of trust versus autonomy. To engage only on the literal level is to treat a sacred, symbolic ritual as if it were a mere traffic dispute. It is to mistake the map for the territory. The intense emotional charge, the feeling of being utterly and existentially right, is the signal that an archetype has been constellated. You are no longer just a person, you have become a warrior for an eternal principle, and this inflation lends the conflict its unbearable weight. When you understand this, the entire dynamic transforms. The goal ceases to be about winning the symbolic battle in the outer world and becomes about understanding what the battle represents within you. The question shifts from, how can I prove them wrong, to, what part of me is at war? What two opposing aspects of my own soul are using this person and this situation as a battlefield? By withdrawing from the literal argument and contemplating its symbolic meaning, you perform an act of profound psychological alchemy. You translate the lead of a petty conflict into the gold of self-knowledge. The other person ceases to be a mere adversary and becomes, unwittingly, a messenger from your own unconscious, an actor in the drama of your individuation. To see the symbol is to break its compulsive power. You can then engage with the real conflict, the inner one, where true integration and growth become possible. When the conflict arises, the instinctual, unconscious response is to spill out, to meet the other's chaotic energy with our own reactive energy. This is the psyche acting in its undifferentiated, primitive state, a seething cauldron with no vessel to hold it. its contents scalding all they touch. To become a containing vessel is to consciously choose to resist this instinct. It is the deliberate and difficult act of building an inner container, a vase, strong enough to hold the boiling, contradictory energies of the conflict without allowing them to erupt or shatter you. This vessel is forged from consciousness itself. Its walls are made of your ability to observe your own reactions without being wholly identified with them, to feel the surge of fury without immediately giving it voice, to feel the pull of despair without collapsing into it. When the other person, gripped by their complex, projects their chaos, their insults, their unreason onto you, the uncontained psyche would throw it back, creating a feedback loop of escalating toxicity. But you, as the vessel, do the opposite. You take in that projected energy, the anger, the accusation, the madness, and you hold it within your own conscious space. You do not swallow it or believe it, that would be to poison yourself. Rather, you contain it. You allow this dark, hot material to exist within your field of awareness without an immediate, reflexive discharge. This act of holding is a form of psychic alchemy. Within the sealed space of the vessel, a transformation begins to occur. The raw, undifferentiated emotions, yours and theirs, are subjected to the heat of your conscious attention. They are forced to interact, to collide, to simmer together. In this process, something new can be born. The primal urge to retaliate may, through this sustained tension, be transformed into a clear insight about the nature of your own shadow. The other person's projected fear may, within your vessel, be transmuted into a genuine, non-reactive compassion for the suffering that underlies their hostility. By refusing to spill the contents, you allow the heavier elements to settle and the more volatile elements to be refined. This is an act of immense strength, not weakness. It requires an ego that is strong enough to not need immediate retaliation, yet humble enough to not claim it is above the conflict. It is the ego that has aligned itself with the steadfastness of the self. The power in this is twofold. First, you break the destructive, unconscious circuit of action and reaction. The other person is left throwing energy into a container that does not throw it back, disrupting their expected pattern and often depriving their complex of the fuel it requires. Second, and more importantly, you transform the very nature of the conflict. What was once an external battle of wills becomes an internal process of distillation. You are no longer a combatant on the field. You are the alchemist in the laboratory, patiently tending the fire, trusting that the process itself will yield a new substance, a higher level of understanding, a greater capacity for integration, or simply the quiet wisdom to know when to simply let the vessel cool and walk away, having transformed the poison within yourself. Even if the outer world remains unchanged, the desire for victory is a primitive and instinctual force, a fire that burns in the blood of the ego. It is the unrefined will to power, seeking to establish dominance, to prove one's strength, and to silence the opposition. In the arena of argument, this drive is a blinding one. It reduces the vast, nuanced landscape of truth to a single, stark battlefield where there can be only one survivor. The ego, in its quest for victory, becomes a tyrant. It must flatten complexity, ignore inconvenient facts, and armor itself against any empathy that might be perceived as a weakness. It is a state of psychological total war, where the goal is not understanding, but annihilation. The cost of this victory, even if achieved, is a profound poverty of the soul. You may stand triumphant over the ruins of your opponent's position, but you have likely trampled the very seeds of truth you sought to defend in the process. You have fortified your own walls, but in doing so, you have sealed yourself inside a fortress of your own making, cut off from the nourishing air of broader perspective. Discernment, in stark contrast, is not a battle cry but a quiet, penetrating gaze. It is the capacity of a consciousness that has begun to align itself with the self, the archetype of wholeness. Discernment does not seek to obliterate the other side, but to understand its structure, its origin, and its place in the larger pattern. It is the faculty that allows you to sift. It asks different questions, not, how can I win, but, what here is true, what here is false, what in this person's position, however poorly expressed, contains a fragment of a truth I have neglected, and what in my own reaction reveals a wound, a bias, or an unexamined shadow. This is a movement from a crude, binary thinking to a psychological subtlety capable of perceiving gradients and holding multiple, contradictory truths in tension. The discerning individual becomes like a skilled jeweler examining a rough stone. The victor simply smashes the rock to prove it is breakable. The one who discerns may conclude that the other person's argument is indeed largely fallacious, but they will also perceive the hidden fear or the unacknowledged yearning that animates it. They can reject the content while understanding, and perhaps even holding space for, the underlying human condition. This discernment extends inward with even greater importance. You learn to discern the voice of your own inner critic from the voice of wise caution. You learn to distinguish a genuine intuitive knowing from a mere emotional reaction. You learn to separate your authentic values from the collective expectations you have internalized. When you choose discernment over victory, you disarm the conflict of its destructive potential. You withdraw from the collective inflation of the battle and return to the sober, sacred ground of your own inner authority. You may still engage, you may still disagree, even passionately, but your energy is no longer that of a conqueror. It is that of a clarifier, a truth seeker. In the end, a victory leaves you with a trophy that quickly tarnishes the submission of another. Discernment leaves you with a lasting gain, a deeper, more integrated understanding of both the world and yourself. It is the difference between winning a skirmish and mastering the art of war, an art whose ultimate goal is not to defeat the enemy, but to achieve a peace born of profound and unshakable self-knowledge. This is not an act of isolation, but of profound connection to the self, the archetype of wholeness and the center of our being. From this centered place, you no longer need to argue. You can observe. You can discern. You can set a boundary without a single word of combat. Your very presence, rooted in your own truth, becomes a statement that requires no external validation. The world is a vast tapestry of the unconscious, and every argument is a collision of unseen worlds. By refusing to collide, you do not vanish. You become the stable ground upon which the chaos must eventually settle. You become, in a word, whole. Let the uninitiated battle with phantoms. Your task is far greater. Your task is to become